The warehouse smelled of gunpowder and obedience. Dante Salvatore stood at the center of it, the way kings stand at the center of everything, unmoved, unhurried, absolute. 3 men knelt on the concrete floor before him, their hands bound behind their backs with zip ties, their faces maps of regret. Blood dripped from the split lip of the one on the left. The one in the middle was crying. The one on the right had stopped breathing 40 seconds ago. Dante didn't look at that one. He looked at the living too. "You stole from me." His voice was quiet. That was the thing people misunderstood about Dante Salvatore. He never raised it. Never needed to. Quiet men in his position didn't need volume. They needed certainty. $17,000 from the West Side collection. You thought I wouldn't notice. "Boss, we can explain." One word. Rocco. Rocco Vitelli stepped forward from the shadows at Dante's right, shorter than his boss by 3 inches, broader through the chest, with a face like a closed fist. He pressed his hand to the crying man's shoulder. Gently, almost. "He doesn't want the explanation," Rocco murmured. "He wants the money back. And a finger. 1 each. Consider it a receipt." Dante was already turning away when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Perimeter breach. North Gate. Civilian. Female. Child. He stopped walking. He read it again. Female. Child. "Deal with the rest," he said to Rocco. And he walked out into the October night. The north gate of his estate sat 3 blocks from the warehouse, a sprawling property in Chicago's River North neighborhood, hidden behind walls of black iron and old stone. His men had her in the driveway, caught between headlights. She was pressed against the hood of an SUV, one arm extended behind her, shielding the small figure tucked at her back. Dante saw the woman first. Dark chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, amber eyes blazing in the floodlights with a fury that didn't match the fear trembling at its edges. A yellow scarf wrapped around her neck, the same shade as the one she'd worn the night she walked out of his penthouse 4 years ago and never came back. His lungs stopped working. Elena. She'd been dragged in through a gap in the north fence during the chaos of tonight's perimeter sweep. Wrong place, wrong night. Or perhaps the universe settling a debt that had been outstanding for years. His men hadn't recognized her. How could they? She'd been a ghost. His ghost. Let her go. His voice came out quieter than usual. Even for him. His men stepped back. Elena straightened. Her chin lifted. That defiant angle he remembered, that small act of courage she deployed like armor. Dante. His name in her mouth sounded like confession and condemnation at once. Elena. He took 1 step toward her. Just 1. Measuring, calculated, the way he moved toward everything, with the patience of a man who never doubted the outcome. 4 years. "I can't explain, Mama." The small voice came from behind Elena's legs. High, clear, certain, the voice of a child who had not yet learned that the world was a place requiring silence and caution. The little girl stepped out from behind her mother. Dark curls, round cheeks, flushed pink from the cold, and eyes the exact color of a winter storm over Lake Michigan, the exact shade of the man standing 10 feet in front of her. His eyes, the girl tilted her head, studying Dante with the fearless curiosity only very small children possess. Then her face broke into a wide, guileless smile. "Daddy!" The word hit the night air and hung there, suspended, crystalline, impossible. Every man in the driveway went utterly still. Elena made a sound, a sharp, wounded intake of breath, and reached down for the child. "Gia, no." But the damage was done. The word had landed, and Dante Salvatore, who had broken men with his bare hands without blinking, who had sat across negotiation tables with killers and walked away the last one standing, who had not flinched when his own father pressed a gun to his temple at 17, Dante Salvatore froze. 1 second, 2, an eternity compressed into the space between a heartbeat and the next. He looked at the girl. At those eyes. His eyes in a tiny, perfect, laughing face. He looked at Elena, at the terror flooding her expression, at the way her arms wrapped around the child, not to comfort, but to shield, to protect from him, and something moved in the locked vault he kept where other men kept their hearts, something ancient, irrevocable. The corners of his mouth curved, slowly, deliberately, the smile of a man who has just understood something that changes everything. "Is that so?" he said softly. Not a question. Elena's voice cracked. She doesn't know what she's saying. She calls every man Rocco. He didn't look away from Elena's face. "Prepare the east wing. 2 rooms. 2 rooms," Rocco repeated, and there was something careful in his voice, something that recognized a tectonic shift when he heard one. Mother and daughter. Dante's gaze dropped to the little girl who was still smiling at him, utterly unafraid. His chest did something he had no word for. "They're staying." Elena stepped backward. "No, you can't. You've had 4 years, Elena." His voice was still quiet, still certain, still absolute. He crouched down to his daughter's eye level, and the movement was so unexpected, this vast, dangerous man folding himself small for a child, that every guard on the property simply stared. The little girl looked at him without blinking. "What's your name?" he asked. "Gia," she said proudly. "Gianna Sophia, but Mama calls me Gia-Bug when she's happy and Gianna when she's mad." A ghost of a smile. "I'll remember that." He stood back to full height and met Elena's eyes. Hers were bright with unshed tears and old terror. His were steady as stones at the bottom of a river. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Neither is she. Elena had built a quiet life from ash and silence. That was the only way to describe the 4 years she'd spent in a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston, 30 minutes north of the city that had tried to swallow her whole. She'd worked as a freelance event planner under the name Elena Marsh. Marchetti had felt too exposed, too easily searchable. She'd made friends carefully, trusted slowly, loved fiercely and privately, in the way of women who have learned that love, displayed too openly, becomes a target. She had loved Gia in full bloom without apology. That had been enough. This, standing in a bedroom the size of her entire apartment, in a mansion that smelled of cedar and expensive authority, with a guard stationed outside her door, was not enough. This was a cage dressed in Italian marble and 800 thread-count sheets. Gia had no such objections. Mama. The little girl pressed her nose against the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the estate's rear garden. Fountain. Clipped hedges. Stone paths lit from below. "It's a castle." "It's a house," Elena said flatly. "The man has horses." Gia pointed to the far paddock, barely visible in the early morning light. "He has horses, Mama." Elena pressed her palms to the cool window glass and stared at the estate. Security cameras at every corner, guards at every gate. She counted 6 from the window alone, and that was only what they wanted her to see. The iron fence was 12 feet high. The road beyond it had no streetlights, no pedestrian traffic, no witnesses. She was not getting out tonight. She was possibly not getting out at all. The knock at the door was precisely 2 raps, firm, controlled. She turned. "Come in." He filled the door frame the way all powerful men fill spaces, not with physical size alone, though he was tall, broad-shouldered, built like centuries of violence distilled into one man, but with presence. Dante Salvatore carried gravity with him. The air changed density around him. He was dressed differently than last night. Dark trousers, a charcoal shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms, collar open, no jacket. A concession to morning domesticity that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. As if he'd shed the armor he wore for enemies and revealed the harder thing beneath. His eyes went immediately to Gia. Gia turned from the window, saw him, and lit up like a match striking. "The horseman," Elena's heart lurched. "Gia?" "You can ride them," Dante said, directly to the child. His voice, which Elena had heard at its most lethal last night, was doing something entirely different now. Lower, softer, stripped of its imperial edge. "After breakfast, if your mother agrees." "Mama agrees," Gia announced. Mama absolutely does not, Elena. He said her name like a verdict. His gaze lifted to hers, and the softness evaporated. Not cruelly. Simply, differently. The man who spoke to Gia and the man who spoke to her were two halves of the same blade. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. She followed him into the hall, pulling the door mostly closed behind her so Gia remained in sight through the gap. He stopped 6 feet away and crossed his arms over his chest, studying her with those storm-gray eyes that her daughter had inherited with devastating precision. Her eyes, he said. Lots of people have gray eyes, not that gray. His jaw tightened. Not that exact shade. A pause. I looked at photos of myself at age 3 this morning, Elena. Would you like to see the comparison? Her throat closed. I'm going to order a DNA test, he continued, his voice measured, precise. Like a man reading a contract he already knew the terms of. A simple cheek swab. Non-invasive. Gia won't even understand what it's for. He tilted his head. Unless you want to save us the time and tell me yourself. Dante, tell me. The quiet crack in those 2 words. Not anger, not yet. Something rawer. Was she already? When you left, were you already 3 weeks? Elena whispered. I found out 3 weeks after I left. Silence. It lasted 10 seconds. 20. Long enough for the guard at the end of the hall to find somewhere else to look. You knew, he said finally. For 3 years and 8 months you knew, and I was protecting her. Her voice steadied on the word her. It always did. You were at war with the Calabrese family. 2 of your capos had been killed in 6 weeks. I would have been leverage, Dante. She would have been leverage. You can't tell me I was wrong. Something moved through his expression. The brief, terrible flash of a man recognizing his own world through someone else's eyes. You should have come to me, he said. Low. Controlled. You would have locked me in a cage. She gestured at the hallway around them. Like this one. This is not a cage. This is protection. His eyes darkened. There's a difference, and you're going to learn it. He turned to go. Your rules won't work on me, she called after him. Whatever you think you own. He stopped. Didn't turn around. I own every room you're standing in. Every road for a mile in every direction. A breath. And I already own half of what matters most to you. Because she has my eyes, Elena. My blood runs in her veins. He finally turned, and his expression did something devastating. Not cruel. Certain. I own you now. Both of you. And this time, you don't get to disappear. He walked away. Elena turned back to Gia's door. Her daughter was pressed against the gap, peering out with those storm-gray eyes, his eyes wide with uncomplicated curiosity. Mama, Gia whispered conspiratorially, I like the horseman. Elena closed her eyes. God help them both. The Salvatore Empire was not a metaphor. It was concrete and iron, blood and ledger, the kind of empire that men spent lifetimes building and rivals spent lifetimes trying to dismantle. Dante walked Elena through it the next morning. Not all of it, not the parts that would require more trust than they've rebuilt, but enough. The estate's command center, a room beneath the main house, walls lined with security feeds, maps, coded communication channels. His senior staff moved around it with the focused quiet of a military operation. The Salvatore family controls 6 districts, he said, standing at the central map table. His finger traced the territory without touching the surface. Habit, Elena guessed, of a man who learned early to point without leaving prints. Construction, distribution, 3 legitimate hospitality businesses that account for 40% of the operation's laundered income. 38 men on active payroll, 12 in reserve. You're telling me this because you're inside my walls and I don't keep secrets from people inside my walls. His eyes slid sideways to hers, unlike others in this room. She absorbed the hit without flinching. That was something she'd gotten better at. What do you want me to say? Nothing, yet. He straightened. I want you to understand first what you've walked back into, what she'd walked back into, as if she'd chosen it, as if 4 years of watching every doorway, checking every car that drove twice down her street, sleeping with a knife in the drawer beside her bed. As if all of that had been leisure, Rocco entered from the far door, tablet in hand, and stopped short at the sight of Elena. His expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been reluctant respect before settling into careful neutrality. "The Marchetti woman," he said to Dante not unkindly. "Elena," Dante corrected, with a quiet authority that made it clear the correction was not optional. Rocco set the tablet on the table. Nero's men were spotted 3 blocks from the north perimeter last night, before the perimeter breach. His gaze moved to Elena. Not accusatory, inquiring. The timing's interesting. The air in the room changed. Elena felt it before she understood it, the particular quality of attention that fills a space when dangerous men start asking questions they already suspect the answers to. "Elena?" Dante's voice was careful. The way someone's voice goes careful when they're trying not to trigger an animal that might bolt. "Is there something you want to tell me about Julian Nero?" Her stomach dropped. She'd known this moment was coming. Had been running from it, in some form, for 4 years. Julian Nero. Sleek, silver-tongued, murderous Julian Nero, who ran his operation 3 territories east of Dante's and had been trying to expand west for a decade. Elena had been catering an event at his private club 4 years ago. A legitimate booking, nothing suspicious, when she'd walked through the wrong door. She'd seen the books, the real ones, names, accounts, shell companies. Enough to dismantle half his operation if it reached the right authorities, or the right rival. Nero had seen her see them. She'd run. First, from Nero. Then, when she'd learned she was pregnant, from everything, from the city, from Dante, from the world where her child would be born into a crossfire. "He's been hunting me," she said. The words tasted like surrender, but they were long overdue. The silence in the room was absolute. Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Rocco. "Clear the room." The staff filtered out with practiced efficiency. Rocco remained. He was, Elena understood, the exception to every privacy rule. "How long?" Dante said. 4 years. She met his eyes. "From almost exactly the time I left. I didn't connect it immediately. I thought I was being careful. I thought I was safe." She exhaled. "Then his men found my apartment in Evanston 6 months ago. I moved again. I've moved 4 times in 4 years, Dante. I've been 1 step ahead of him every time." Her voice steadied. "I got good at it." Rocco let out a low whistle. "She's been running solo from Nero for 4 years with a child in tow." He looked at Dante. "That's not nothing." "No," Dante agreed. His eyes hadn't left her face. "What did you see?" she told him. All of it. The room, the books, the names. She'd memorized every number that night in the terrified way. The mind records what might kill you. When she finished, the silence had a different texture, the weight of intelligence that changes the shape of a war. "That's enough to end him," Dante said quietly. "That's why he wants to end her," Rocco replied. Dante pushed back from the table and walked to the window. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass, jaw set, eyes distant, mind moving through calculations she couldn't follow. She watched the moment he arrived at a decision, watched his shoulders settle into the particular stillness of a man who has mapped the path forward and finds it acceptable, regardless of the cost. "You're not running anymore," he said to his reflection. "Dante, you ran because you thought you were alone." He turned. "You're not alone anymore." His gaze was direct, immovable. "You're in my house, under my protection, which means Nero just made the last mistake of his life by coming within 3 blocks of my perimeter." He moved to leave. Elena reached out, instinct, not thought, and caught his arm. He stopped, looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up at her face, with an expression that was entirely unreadable and entirely consuming. "He's more dangerous than you think," she said. "He's not just a rival. He's been building something that takes down empires." A beat. Then Dante placed his hand over hers, large, warm, deliberate. and his touch burned straight through her skin and settled somewhere under her ribs where she'd been trying to keep him locked out for 4 years. "So have I," he said simply. He walked away. Rocco lingered, studying Elena with the sharp, calibrating eyes of a man whose job was reading people. Then he nodded. Once, slowly, the nod of someone granting provisional trust. "He looked for you," Rocco said quietly. "For 8 months after you left, wouldn't say why. Just looked." He tucked the tablet under his arm. "Thought you should know." He left her standing there, her hand still warm from where Dante had held it. In the monitor feeds above the table, a camera caught the estate's north road, a dark sedan idling at the corner. Waiting. They were already here. The results came back on a Thursday. Dante held the single page for exactly 30 seconds before setting it face down on his desk. He didn't need the numbers. The numbers merely confirmed what every cell in his body had already accepted. The moment a 3-year-old girl looked at him with his mother's eyes and called him by the name he'd never been called before. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. He sat for a long time in the quiet of his study. Outside the window, October had deepened into the particular cold that Lake Michigan sends inland like a warning. The garden lights caught the bare branches of the oak trees and threw long shadows across the stone. Somewhere in the east wing, his daughter was sleeping. His daughter. The phrase arrived differently each time he tried to hold it. Too large, too specific, too real. He'd been 29 when Elena left. He told himself it was nothing. A brief, incandescent connection that burned itself out the way those things did. He told himself he didn't look for her for 8 months out of pride, or strategy, or the simple practicality of a man who didn't chase what left willingly. He'd been lying. He knew that now. He was still sitting there when he heard the small voice in the hallway. "I can't sleep." He rose and opened the study door. Gia stood in the corridor in a white nightgown, dark curls loose, clutching a stuffed rabbit Elena had retrieved from their emergency bag. She blinked up at him with those storm-gray eyes, entirely unafraid, carrying the calm authority of a child who has always been utterly certain of her own welcome. "Your room has a nightlight," he said, because it was the first practical thing he could locate. "The light has a monster shadow," she informed him gravely. He considered this. "Come in." She padded into his study and installed herself on the leather chair across from his desk with the confidence of someone taking her rightful seat. She looked around at the books, the maps, the locked cabinet, the single photograph on the wall. His mother, 20 years gone. "Who's that lady?" she asked, pointing. "My mother. Where is she? She died when I was young." Gia absorbed this with the solemn, unsentimental acceptance that only young children manage. "I don't have a daddy," she announced. Then she looked at him sideways. "Mama says he's gone." His jaw tightened. "Does she?" "I told Joshua at daycare my daddy is a knight." She hugged her rabbit. "He has a sword and fights monsters." Something in his chest cracked open, clean and irreversible, like ice breaking in spring. He crossed the room and crouched to her eye level. "What if your daddy fights the monsters so you don't have to?" he said quietly. She looked at him for a long, searching moment. Children, he was learning, were much better at this than adults. The looking, the seeing, no performance, no agenda, just assessment. "Okay," she decided simply. She held out her arms. He picked her up. The weight of her, small, solid, smelling of the lavender soap Elena used on her curls, was the most terrifying and most precious thing he had ever held. He stood there, in the middle of his study with his daughter in his arms, and stared at the photograph of his mother, and thought that if she could see this, she'd have smiled. He was still standing there when Elena appeared in the doorway. She stopped. Her face did something complex and devastating, a war between relief and grief and the fragile, dangerous hope of someone who has been afraid for so long that peace feels like a trap. "She wandered," he said. "She does that?" Elena's voice was careful. "I'll take her. She's asleep." He was right. Gia had gone boneless against his chest, rabbit pressed to her cheek, out with the sudden, absolute certainty of exhausted children. Elena stepped into the room and stood close, closer than she'd allowed herself since arriving. Close enough that he could smell the faint trace of jasmine in her hair. She reached up to take Gia. Their hands met over the child's small back. Skin to skin. Still. The accidental architecture of a moment neither of them had planned. Neither of them moved. The fire in the study hearth crackled. Outside, wind pressed against the windows. Between them, 4 years of silence vibrated with everything unspoken. Elena. His voice was low. Private. A frequency that existed only between the two of them in this firelit room. Look at me. She looked up. Amber eyes bright with the tears she was holding back with absolute discipline. I'm angry, he said honestly. I want you to know that. What was taken from me, those 3 years, 8 months, her first word, her first step. His jaw worked. I'm furious. I know. A whisper. And I understand why you ran. He said it with the precision of a man who has processed something painful enough times to speak it cleanly. You were protecting her. From my world, from what loving me costs, he inhaled. I understand it. I don't forgive it yet. Dante, but I will. He shifted Gia gently, tucking her more securely against his shoulder, and with his free hand he reached up and touched Elena's face, the side of her jaw, his thumb at the corner of her mouth, the lightest possible pressure that nonetheless struck her like thunder. Because you're here now, and because she's here, and because I am not the same man I was 4 years ago. What kind of man are you now? She breathed. His thumb moved. A fraction, a deliberate, inexorable slide along her lower lip. The kind who doesn't let what's his walk away twice, he said. And then he kissed her. Not the way he might have kissed her 4 years ago, possessive, consuming, demanding. He kissed her the way a man kisses something he almost lost forever, carefully, precisely, every point of contact deliberate and reverent, his mouth moving over hers with the controlled intensity of a man who is holding the entirety of himself in careful check, because the thing in his arms is sleeping and the woman in front of him is, finally here. She kissed him back. Of course she did. She'd been kissing him back for 4 years in every quiet, unguarded moment she'd allowed herself before forcing herself to stop. When they parted, his forehead dropped to hers. Her hands had found the lapel of his shirt, gripping it the way people grip things they're afraid of losing in strong current. I'll burn the world for you, he said against her mouth. Both of you, whatever it costs. She believed him. That was the most frightening thing of all. The Salvatore family had a tradition for truce. It was old, older than Dante's grandfather, who had brought it from Calabria along with his name and his enemies. When a truth was told in the Salvatore house that changed the shape of the family's future, it was witnessed, spoken aloud, sealed. On the 5th day of Elena's residence in the estate, Dante called a gathering. Not his full operation. This was family only. Rocco, his uncle Enzo, silver-haired and sharp-minded, who served as the family's legal architecture, his 2 senior capos, Sal and Dom, men in their 40s who had served since before Dante inherited the seat, and Elena. She sat at the long dining table dressed in the clothes Dante had arranged, simple, dark, no concession to theatrics. She looked like what she was, a woman who had survived 4 years alone and carried herself with the particular dignity of hard-won independence. Gia was with a carefully vetted household member in the playroom above them. Elena Marchetti, Dante said, standing at the head of the table. Gia's mother, DNA confirmed. He paused, and his gaze moved over each face in the room. My daughter's mother. The silence that followed held the particular compressed quality of held breath. Enzo was the first to speak. You're certain. 99.97%. A flicker. Yes. Then she is family. Enzo said it simply, as a man stating arithmetic. Gia is a Salvatore, which makes Elena untouchable. From this table, and beyond it. The capos exchanged looks. Not resistant, Elena noticed, but recalibrating, updating their internal architecture of loyalty and protection. She was learning how this world worked. It moved not on emotion, but on the cold, efficient currency of blood and obligation. She was in the ledger now. "What do you know about Nero's operation?" Sal asked her directly. She told them everything, again, more fully, watching Enzo's pen move across his notepad with the steady precision of a man who spoke 6 languages and had put 4 men in federal prison without leaving a fingerprint. By the time she finished, the table had gone very still with the concentration of men who recognize actionable intelligence. "She's been carrying this for 4 years, Dom said slowly. "Alone," Rocco added, and there was something in his voice that approximated approval. "There's more," Elena said. She'd been holding this piece, the piece that was both confession and warning. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and withdrew a USB drive. Black, worn at one corner, the kind of small object that contains large catastrophes. "The night I saw the books, I photographed every page." She set it on the table. 53 pages, account numbers, shell company structures, names. She met Dante's eyes. "I kept it as insurance, in case Nero ever caught up with me." A pause. "In case I needed to take him down to survive." She watched Dante look at the drive, then at her. "You said you were a freelance event planner," he said. "I am." A ghost of a smile, a very careful one. For a moment, something moved through his expression that looked like pure, unfiltered admiration, before he schooled it back behind control. "This changes the timeline," Rocco said. "Nero knows she's been running. He'll escalate now that she's been stationary for 5 days in one location." "He'll know where she is," Sal agreed. "He already knows." Dante's voice had gone flat, cold. He was already somewhere else in his mind, somewhere in the machinery of strategy and violence that kept his empire breathing. Someone told him. The room shifted. Elena felt it, the particular drop in temperature that arrives when a room full of people starts looking at each other and subtracting. "The perimeter breach," Rocco said quietly. "The sedan on the North Road. Our location isn't posted, isn't on any registry. Someone close told him." Dante repeated. He looked around the table, each face, one at a time, and when his gaze swept past the door to the corridor beyond, his eyes ticked sideways and lingered for a fraction of a second on something only he could see. The family photograph on the hall wall, his cousin Marco smiling from the back row. A muscle in Dante's jaw flickered. "Enjoy, tonight," he said quietly. The table didn't know what the words meant. Elena didn't yet either. Tomorrow, the shape of things will change. He reached across the table and picked up the USB drive, held it for a moment, looking at it, then he looked at Elena, and something passed between them, the particular recognition of 2 people who have both been carrying the same weight from opposite sides, and have only just discovered that the weight was always meant to be shared. He closed his fist around the drive. "You proved yourself tonight," he said, "for the table, but to her. Whatever you thought this family was, whatever you feared it would cost you, hear me when I tell you, you are this family now." He set the drive in front of Enzo. Blood oath. Elena Marchetti and Gianna Salvatore. Enzo wrote the names. The pen scratched across the page. Somewhere in the estate, a door closed that Elena hadn't heard open. The assassination attempt came at 2047 in the morning. Elena heard Gia's voice first, her daughter's sleep-confused cry cutting through the dark of their shared room, then the sound that had snapped Elena awake, the distant crack of suppressed gunfire, the specific sound of glass under pressure, the low thud of a man who would not get up again. She was on her feet before her eyes fully opened. Old instinct. 4 years of sleeping with one ear toward the door, running her own security in a 1-bedroom apartment with a baby on her hip. She scooped Gia from the bed. "Mama." Gia pressed her face against Elena's neck, rabbit in one arm. Still half asleep. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, baby. Close your eyes." She moved to the door and pressed her back against the wall beside it, peering through the gap she'd left open the way she always left it open. Old habit, situational awareness, every exit mapped. The corridor was dark. Emergency lighting kicked on 3 seconds later, casting everything in flat red. 2 of Dante's guards were already positioned outside her door. "Mrs. Marchetti, I need to move." Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that is indistinguishable from calm, but is actually compressed terror operating at absolute precision. "Where?" Mr. Salvatore said. "Sal." Dante's voice from the far end of the corridor. He was moving toward them at a controlled pace, gun at his side, shirt half unbuttoned, and his expression was something Elena had no framework for. His eyes swept her, head to foot, inventory of damage, relief when he found none, then landed on Gia, and his entire face changed. "Come." She came. Gia peered over her shoulder at Dante with drowsy curiosity. He led them through a passage she hadn't known existed, behind the study bookcase, down a flight of stone stairs, into a room below ground level that was clearly built for exactly this: reinforced walls, a cot, sealed comms, a weapons locker, a panic room dressed as a safe house. He turned to face her. She could see now a cut on his left forearm. Not deep, already clotting, and the residue of the night written in the tension of every line of him. 3 shooters, he said. Nero's men. They targeted the East Wing. His eyes moved to Gia. The East Wing, their wing. Their wing. They knew exactly which rooms. "The traitor," Elena said. "I have a suspicion." His voice had gone very quiet, the quiet before catastrophic weather. "It's being confirmed." Gia had been watching Dante from the safety of Elena's arms. Now she reached out, the way children do, with complete unconscious trust, and patted his face with one small hand. "You're hurt," she observed. He looked at her hand on his cheek. Something moved through him, violent and tender at once, a seismic shift in a man built of bedrock. "I'm fine," he said. "Horse." "Mama kisses it better," Gia advised him. Elena laughed, unexpected, fractured half-sob. "Gia." But Dante was looking at Elena with an expression that demolished every wall she'd spent 4 years building between herself and this exact feeling. The devastating recognition of being seen, being chosen, being claimed not as possession but as center, the thing around which everything else is organized. He reached across and took Gia gently, settling the child against his shoulder with the ease of a man who has already, in 5 days, become someone she trusts as gravity. Then he took Elena's face in his free hand. "I need you to understand something," he said. Low. Intense. The room contracted to just the 3 of them. "Whatever I've built out there, the empire, the territory, the blood, and the ledger, none of it matters. You and she are what I'll burn it all down for." His thumb traced her jaw. "And if you think for 1 second that I'll let Nero's hands touch either of you, Dante, mine," he said. "Not a declaration of ownership, a declaration of intent. A promise dressed in 1 word. Both of you, say it back to me." She looked at him. This dangerous, tender, furious, careful man holding their daughter on 1 arm and her heart in the other. And said what she'd been refusing to say since the first night she ran. "Yours," she whispered. The word settled over them like a seal. He kissed her, deep, certain, the kind of kiss that means "I'm choosing this. I choose this, I will always choose this." And Gia made a sleepy sound of contentment between them, pressing her face into his neck. When they parted, his expression was resolved. "Get her back to sleep," he said. "I have something to deal with." He handed Gia back, their hands overlapping once more in the transfer, and then he turned toward the stairs. "War is coming," she said to his back. He didn't pause. "War is already here, Elena." His voice carried absolute certainty. "I'm just making it official." It began on a Tuesday and didn't stop. Nero moved on 3 fronts simultaneously. The synchronized attack of a man who had been planning his offensive for 4 years, waiting for the moment that Dante Salvatore had something worth destroying. Until Elena, Dante's one vulnerability had been his empire. Structures could be rebuilt. Men could be replaced. Territories contested and reclaimed. But a daughter, a woman carrying the Salvatore heir? Those were weaknesses that only required 1 precise strike. Nero was precise. The first strike came at the docks. Salvatore distribution disrupted, 2 men hospitalized, 1 cargo shipment torched in the harbor. Dante was at the docks before the fire was out, standing in the light of it with Rocco at his side, watching 3 seasons of careful negotiation turn to smoke and ash. "He's making noise," Rocco said. "He's making mistakes." Dante watched the flames. Noise is what men make when they're afraid in covering it. The second strike was worse. Dom was found outside his restaurant in the South Loop at 9 that evening. He would survive. 3 broken ribs, a shattered collarbone. But the message was anatomically specific. I can reach anyone. Dante arrived home to find Elena pacing the length of the kitchen, Gia in bed, her amber eyes sharp with fury. "Tell me what's happening," she said. He told her. All of it. Not the sanitized version he might have given a woman he was protecting from his world, but the real version, the one he gave to equals. She listened without flinching, processing with the same calibrated intelligence that had kept her alive for 4 years. "He's fleshing you out," she said, "hitting your people until you come to him on his terms. Yes, don't. Elena, don't let him set the terms." She crossed her arms. "He's been making you react. Stop reacting. Make him move where you want him." Rocco, standing in the doorway, made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. He swallowed it. Dante looked at her for a long, level moment. "The USB," he said. "The USB," she confirmed. The plan was elegant in the way of things that turn an enemy's weapon against him. The information on that drive, leaked selectively to specific targets, would fragment Nero's alliances before the week was out. His financial partners would scatter. His security apparatus would collapse inward. They worked through the night. Elena at the table with Enzo, cross-referencing her 4-year-old memory against current intelligence. Dante moving between the room and the operations center below, coordinating deployment. At 3 a.m, the call came. Gia's room. Elena was up the stairs before the guard finished speaking. Dante was behind her, 3 steps back, gun drawn by reflex. The room was empty. Not disturbed, not ransacked. Simply empty. The window, closed and locked per protocol, had been opened from outside with the precision of tools and expertise. The stuffed rabbit lay on the floor beside the bed. Elena's legs nearly gave out. Dante caught her before she fell. His hands on her shoulders, his chest against her back, his mouth at her ear. "Breathe, Elena, breathe." He took her. The words came out broken. "He took Gia. I will find her." His voice was absolute. Cut from stone. "I will find her in the next 6 hours, or I will end every person he has ever spoken to. I swear this on my blood." She turned in his arms and looked at him. His face, inches from hers, was the face of a man who has discarded every limitation he ever placed on himself. "Find her," she said. "Please." He released her, turned to Rocco, who was already on the phone. Turned to the guards who were already assembling. Every resource, every favor owed, every thread of the Salvatore network. He pulled them all at once with the controlled ferocity of a man who no longer had anything to lose by being moderate. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his phone. Dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. A federal contact. Old debt, deep ledger. "It's Salvatore," he said. "I need a location. Julian Nero. Everything you have, now." A pause. "The debt is paid in full. All of it. Just find my daughter." He hung up and looked at his men. "Find her," he said. Quiet, absolute. "And God help the ones who make me wait." Julian Nero did not live in darkness. That was the thing that struck Elena when they brought her in. Because they'd taken her to 20 minutes after Gia, snatching her from the estate perimeter in the brief window of chaos following the child's disappearance. They brought her to a building that looked like a hotel in the Gold Coast district. Clean lines, polished marble, art in the corridors, the architecture of legitimate money over illegitimate foundation. They separated her from Gia immediately. That was the only blow that landed. Everything else, the chair, the zip ties, the cold room, Nero's measured monologue about leverage and information. None of it touched the part of Elena that mattered, Because she had already mentally located the room's 2 exits, assessed the guard rotation she'd counted in the corridor, and identified the ventilation grate in the corner that a 3-year-old girl could fit through if Elena could get to her. She had not survived 4 years alone by being breakable. Nero sat across from her in a chair worth more than her car, silver-haired at 48, handsome in the architectural way of men who have never gone without anything. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were empty. "The drive," he said. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Elena." He sighed as if disappointed. "I've been patient for 4 years. That patience has a specific expiration date." "Noted." He smiled. "You're remarkable, actually. Most people crack at the sight of this room. The association with it is enough." He stood and walked to the window. "Your daughter is comfortable. Well fed. She's been asking for her rabbits." Elena's hands, secured behind her back, curled into fists. "I want the drive location and Salvatore's current operational structure," Nero continued. "In exchange, you and the child walk out of here tonight." He turned. "He won't come for you. Not in time. He doesn't know where you are." She looked at him steadily. "He'll find me. No one finds people I don't want found. Dante Salvatore found my apartment 4 different times in 4 years," she said. "Through 4 different identities. I just didn't know he was looking." She tilted her head. "He'll find me. And when he does, you should be very far away." Nero's pleasant expression cooled by several degrees. In the corridor outside, she heard a door open, then "Mama?" Gia's voice. Small, confused, carrying the particular unguarded fear of a child who is holding herself together through sheer force of 3-year-old determination because she knows her mother needs her to. Elena's throat closed. "Tell me where the drive is," Nero said. "I'll tell you nothing. Then we'll wait for Salvatore's men to find this location, which, as I said, they won't." The window behind him exploded inward. Not glass, not force. A small device. Concussive, directed, designed to disorient without destroy. The room filled with white noise and displaced air. The guards by the door stumbled. Elena was already moving. She had her wrists out of the zip ties. She'd been working them for 90 minutes. She dislocated her thumb slightly to do it. A trick Mia had taught her from a self-defense course they'd taken together 3 years ago, and she came up off the chair in the same motion, collected the closest guard's sidearm from its holster before he regained his balance, and pressed through the door into the corridor. Gia was there, unguarded for exactly 2 seconds in the chaos, a window that Elena took with absolute precision. She had her daughter in her arms and the corridor mapped in her mind, and 3 seconds of suppression from the device still running when the door at the far end of the corridor opened. Rocco stepped through it. Behind him, 4 of Dante's men. Behind them, Dante. He scanned the corridor in under a second, found Elena, found Gia. His entire body went through a change that had no name in any language she knew. The animal relief of a predator who has located what it was hunting, combined with the devastation of a man who was looking at what almost was. Then he looked behind her, at Nero's guards recovering their feet, at Nero himself in the doorway. Dante's expression became something simple and final. "Take them out," he said to Rocco. Then he looked at Nero. "He's mine." Elena pressed Gia's face against her shoulder. 3 shots. Fast, deliberate, restrained. Dante could have emptied the clip, but he didn't. He used exactly what the moment required. Nero ran. Of course he ran. Men who built their empires on other people's fear always ran when the fear turned on them. "The traitor," Rocco said, falling in beside Dante as they moved. "It was Marco, your cousin." He said it quietly, privately, in the practiced way of a man delivering catastrophic information without letting it land on everyone in the room. Dante stopped walking. 1 breath. 2. Where is he? Flat. Absolute. Contained. Waiting for your word. Dante turned to Elena. She was watching him with Gia on her hip, her daughter's face buried in her neck. One hand pressed over Gia's ear to shield her from whatever came next. His eyes moved over them both. Cataloging, they're safe, they're here, they're mine. And something in him re-anchored. Not tonight, he said. About Marco. About all of it. He crossed to Elena and pressed his hand to the side of her face. Tender, shaking very slightly, the only evidence of the 4 hours he'd spent tearing this city apart looking for her. Tonight we go home. She leaned into his hand. One of us might die tonight, he said almost to himself. His eyes moved to Nero's retreating figure, already being cornered by his men at the building's far exit. Just not us. Julie and Nero made it to the parking level. That was further than he deserved. Dante came down the stairwell at a pace that consumed the distance without hurry, the way hunters move when the outcome is already settled, and only the execution remains. Rocco was to his left, 2 men behind them. Nero's remaining guards, 5 of them, stationed at the vehicles, formed a line at the bottom of the stairs. 5 men. Dante didn't pause. The first went down before he reached the bottom step. The second caught Rocco's elbow across his throat. The third and fourth were quick, efficient violence, the kind Dante had been trained in since before he could shave. And the fifth stood between him and Nero with a weapon raised, and the particular look of a man who is calculated, the math and found it terminal. Don't, the man said. Dante looked at him. Last chance to live. The man stepped aside. Nero had backed himself into the corner between an SUV and the concrete wall. His silver hair was disordered. His expensive suit had torn at the shoulder. He looked, in this moment, precisely like what he was. A man who had spent 40 years hiding behind other people's violence and had finally run out of proxies. Salvatore, you took my daughter. Dante's voice was quiet. The specific quiet that had preceded the end of lives. You put your hands on my family. It was leverage. It was a negotiation tactic. She's 3 years old. The words dropped from him like stones. She's 3 years old and she was asking for her rabbit. Nero opened his mouth. The service door to the left burst open. Elena came through it. She'd given Gia to Rocco's secondary team, found the stairs, traced Dante's path with the navigational certainty of a woman who had spent 4 years learning to map dangerous territory fast. She came through the door carrying one of the guards' discarded weapons, her hair loose and her amber eyes, carrying 4 years of running, 4 years of fear, 4 years of a mother keeping herself upright purely through will. She stopped when she saw Nero. He saw her, and in his face she saw the specific expression of a man who has made a calculation, who has decided that the woman with the weapon matters more than the one he doesn't have a clear angle on, who has decided that one last act of violence might still save him. He moved. Elena shot first. Not center mass, not fatal. Her hand was steadier than it had any right to be, and she put the round to his right shoulder, the shoulder of the hand holding his weapon. With the precision of 4 years of weekly range time at a private facility in Evanston, where a single mother had quietly, methodically, made herself into someone who could protect her child if the night ever required it. The night had required it. Nero hit the wall with a sound of impact and outrage and went down. Silence. Dante turned and looked at her. She lowered the weapon. Her hands were shaking now. After, when the moment of extreme focus releases its grip, that was always when the shaking came. You shot him, he said. I shot his shoulder. She exhaled. I've been practicing for 3 years. Something passed through Dante's expression. Vast, complex, the face of a man encountering a person who continuously exceeds every expectation he constructs. Then he covered the distance between them in 4 steps and pulled her against him, his arms around her completely, his face pressed to the top of her head. She shook for exactly 30 seconds, letting it move through her the way storms move. Fast, consuming. Then gone. Then she steadied, her fists closing in his shirt, her face pressed against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat, alive, real, present. Gia, she said against his chest. Safe. With Rocco. She asked him if he had any snacks. His voice was muffled by her hair. She felt his laugh. Brief, incredulous, the laugh of a man who has been gut-punched by tenderness. She's my daughter, all right. She laughed too. The fractured, tear-edged laugh that comes after catastrophe when the people you love are intact. He held her tighter. I told you, she said. Told me what? He's more dangerous than you think. She pulled back to look at his face. Was. His eyes moved to Nero's hunched figure against the wall, surrounded now by Dante's men. Alive. Barely. Contained. The data on the drive, that drive, already with Enzo, already in motion, would do the rest. The financial dismantling. The federal case. The end of a 4-year nightmare in ledger and law. Dante looked at her. Never leaving you again, he said. I mean that. I know. She held his face in her hands. I know you do. Behind them, Rocco appeared with Gia on his hip. The little girl scanned the garage with wide, curious eyes, assessed the situation with the uncanny equanimity of children who trust completely in their safe people, and then reached both arms toward Dante. He took her. She pressed her cheek to his. You found us, she said. I'll always find you, he told her. Both of you. Because you're a knight, Gia confirmed. Because I'm a knight, Dante agreed. Elena watched the two of them, her daughter and her daughter's father, storm-grey eyes matching in the harsh light of a parking garage that smelled of gunpowder and exhaust. And something settled in her chest that had been unsettled for 4 years. Not peace exactly. Not yet. But the promise of peace. The scaffolding of it. The shape it would take when the last of the wreckage was cleared. She moved to stand beside them, and Dante's arm came around her without question. The three of them stood there, whole and breathing. Behind them, the last of Julian Nero's empire knelt on the concrete floor and waited. The legal dismantling of Julian Nero's operation took 11 days. The personal one took one conversation. Enzo, operating with the quiet lethality of a man who had spent 30 years building legal structures specifically for moments like this, submitted the USB data through 4 separate channels: a federal contact, a district attorney in his debt, 2 investigative journalists with impeccable records, and a financial crimes unit that had been building a case against Nero for 6 years and simply needed the final architecture Elena's photographs provided. By the end of the first week, Nero's financial partners had scattered to 4 continents. By the end of the second, 3 of his lieutenants had accepted plea agreements. By the 11th day, Julian Nero was transferred from the private medical facility, where Dante had generously agreed he could receive treatment for his shoulder, to federal custody. Elena heard the news from Rocco, who delivered it in the kitchen over coffee, with the compressed satisfaction of a man reporting an enemy's permanent neutralization. It's done? She asked. The federal filing is complete. His assets are frozen. The empire is gone. Rocco allowed himself a small, precise smile. He'll be in his mid-60s before he sees daylight again, and by then there won't be anyone left who owes him anything. She sat with that for a moment. 4 years. 4 years of one step ahead, of moving apartments, of sleeping lightly, of calibrating every decision around the single most important variable in her life. It's over. She found Dante in the study. He was standing at the window, the same window where she'd stood on the first morning, mapping exits. He was looking at the garden, where Gia was currently visible with a young groundskeeper, examining the fish in the stone pond with the focused, scientific intensity of a toddler conducting fieldwork. Her dark curls were loose. Her yellow rain boots were on the wrong feet. She was completely magnificent. She put those boots on herself, Dante said, without turning. He'd heard Elena come in. He always heard her. She insists. She's stubborn. A pause. She gets it from her mother. She gets it from her father. Elena came to stand beside him. His arm moved around her waist automatically, the way it had been doing for 2 weeks now, without deliberation, without performance, simply the instinct of a man orienting toward what he wants close. You stubborn man. He looked sideways at her. How are you? Lighter, she said honestly. He's contained. The empire's dismantled. Marco. He stopped. The flinch was small, but she saw it. His cousin Marco had been held in a guarded room in the basement for 4 days, while Dante decided what justice looked like when the betrayal was family. She'd heard later from Rocco that Dante had gone in alone and come out an hour later with no marks on either of them. But Marco had been seen to his car with everything he owned and driven out of state. Marco is gone, Dante finished. He won't come back. And if he does, he won't. She believed him. It's finally over, she said quietly. He turned to look at her fully then, and his expression held the particular quality she had come to recognize as Dante Salvatore's version of exposed, the face he made when he put down the armor and wasn't entirely certain yet what was beneath it. Raw intelligence, fractured history, the specific grief of a man who has spent decades building walls he is only now beginning to take apart. I want you to stay, he said. Directly, without preamble. I know this isn't what you chose. I know this life comes at a cost. I know what I'm asking. His eyes held hers. But I'm asking anyway, Dante. Not as my captive, not as leverage or arrangement. He turned to face her fully, and his hands bound her face, both of them, his palms against her jaw, his thumbs below her cheekbones, holding her the way people hold things they have come very close to losing, as mine, freely, because you choose it. She looked at him. This man who had frozen in a driveway at a single word from a gray-eyed child, who had crouched to his daughter's eye level in the middle of the night and offered to fight her monsters, who had torn apart a city for 8 hours to find 2 people he had only had for 5 days. I choose it, she said. His exhale was slow, like something releasing that had been held for a very long time. Outside, Gia found the fish. Her shout of discovery rang across the garden. Papa, Papa, look! They both turned. Gia was waving at the window with both arms, pointing at the pond with the urgent enthusiasm of someone reporting significant breaking news. She'd shifted from daddy to papa somewhere around day 4, with the fluid vocabulary adaptation of children who adopt language that fits. Neither of them had corrected it. Dante raised his hand and waved back. The transformation on his face, the absolute devastating openness of it, was something Elena would carry with her for the rest of her life. The Empire's secure? She asked. Secure. He looked down at her. For the first time in years. A pause. I have everything I need to keep it that way. Good. She settled against his side. Then we can start building what comes next. Agreed, he said. He kissed the top of her head. Outside, Gia fell into the pond. The ring had belonged to Dante's grandmother. It had come to Chicago from Calabria in a silk pouch inside a leather boot, which his grandmother had maintained was the only place a woman could be trusted to hide something precious in a world full of men who thought they owned everything. She had been, by all accounts, the only person his grandfather was genuinely afraid of. Dante thought, looking at the ring in his palm on a Wednesday morning in late November, that he understood his grandfather a great deal better now than he ever had before. You're going to propose with that? Rocco leaned against the doorframe of the study. He'd been briefed. He always was. It's beautiful, he allowed. Also, you should know she'll probably argue. She argues about everything. She argued about the grocery order yesterday. The system should have included her brand of Dante. Rocco looked at him with the particular patience of a man who has watched his boss be expertly managed for 3 weeks by a woman and a 3-year-old. Just ask her. I'm aware of how proposals work, Rocco. Are you? Because you look like you're planning a hostile acquisition. Dante closed his hand around the ring. He wasn't wrong. The Salvatore family gathered for dinner at 7, the way they gathered every Thursday. Enzo, the senior capos, the people who constituted the functioning core of a family that was both blood and bond. Elena had been incorporated into these evenings with the gradual naturalness of something that had always been missing and is now simply present. She sat at Dante's right hand without ceremony. Gia, theoretically at the children's table in the adjacent room, had been found twice under the main table during previous dinners, and the third time had simply been permitted to stay, installed in a chair between Dante and Enzo, who appeared completely delighted by her presence and had taken to bringing her small gifts of unclear origin. Tonight, Gia was wearing a dress she'd selected herself. Clashing colors, she looked magnificent. Dinner progressed. Conversation moved across the table with the layered efficiency of people who conducted the business of the world in the margins of their meals. Wine was poured. Elena was mid-sentence about the catering company she'd been quietly, tentatively, researching as a legitimate business venture when Dante stood up. The table went quiet, not the silence of surprise. These people read rooms for a living. The silence of a room that recognizes a significant moment approaching and clears the field for it. Dante looked at Elena. She looked at him. Her expression moved from conversation to alertness to something much more complicated in the span of 2 seconds. He reached into his jacket pocket. "Dante, marry me," he said. Simple. Direct. The way he said everything that mattered. He set the ring on the table in front of her, open, visible, glinting under the chandelier. Not because of Gia, not because of territory or alliance or code. Because I have spent 4 years in a city you were also in and I didn't know, and the waste of it is something I refuse to repeat. He paused. "Marry me, Elena. Let me protect what's mine, with a ring and a name instead of just with guns and men." The table held its collective breath. Elena looked at the ring. Then at him, then at Gia, who was looking between both of them with enormous gray eyes and an expression of intense, focused attention. "If I say no," Elena said slowly, "what happens? I kidnap you." He said it without inflection. Same as last time, more comfortable accommodations, since we'll have had the practice. The table exhaled in laughter. Enzo set down his wine. Rocco pressed his hand over his mouth. Elena's mouth curved. "You can't kidnap your future wife," she said. "Future wife," he repeated. The word moved through him visibly, a small, private earthquake. "Is that a yes?" She picked up the ring, turned it in her fingers, then held out her hand. He took it, slid the ring on with the careful deliberation of a man conducting a sacred act. The diamond caught the light. Old cut, warm gold setting, worn smooth at the edges by 60 years of a marriage that had survived war and grief, and 3 children and a transatlantic move. "Yes," she said. Quietly, certainly. "You yeah." Gia slapped both hands on the table. "Mama said yes." Enzo started laughing, a real laugh, from deep in his chest, the kind he rarely permitted himself in company. Rocco made a sound that was definitely an emotional cough. The capos raised their glasses. Dante looked at his daughter, who was standing on her chair with absolutely no concept of the safety implications, arms raised like a victorious athlete. "Sit down, Gia Bug," he said, and his voice was the gentlest she'd ever heard it. She sat, and then, with the fluid expertise of a child who knows exactly which moves produce which results, she climbed from her chair across to Dante's and installed herself in his lap, pressed her face against his shoulder and said, contentedly, into his jacket, "My papa is getting married." He closed his arm around her. Elena watched them both, this man and this child. Storm-grey eyes matching in the warm light of a dinner that had become the marker of before and after. And she felt the last door she'd kept locked swing open. "Marry me, or I'll kidnap you again," she whispered back at him. His eyes crinkled. "Principessa, don't call me that," she said. "I'm going to call you that forever," he promised. She leaned across the table and kissed him once, cleanly, in front of everyone. The table applauded. Gia covered her eyes in theatrical horror. 8 months later, the wedding of Dante Salvatore and Elena Marchetti took place on a Saturday in late June, in the garden of the estate where they had been found and lost, and found again. There were no invitations sent to enemies, no rival families present at the tables, no display of power in the architecture of the day. Those who attended had earned their place through loyalty and love. A smaller gathering than the Salvatore name might have warranted, and precisely the gathering Dante had chosen. Elena wore white, not the white of performance or tradition, but the white of a woman who had earned the brightness of the day. Simple lines, nothing excessive. A veil she'd chosen with Mia during an afternoon that had involved considerable crying and a shared bottle of Prosecco. She held small flowers, pale roses, a spray of eucalyptus, and she stood at the garden threshold on the arm of Enzo, who had offered with such quiet dignity, that she'd been unable to refuse, and who now walked her down the stone path with the careful pride of a man who has lived long enough to recognize a watershed moment in the history of his family. Dante stood at the garden altar, an arch of iron and pale roses, built by his groundskeeper over 3 days, and watched her come toward him with an expression that Elena would later describe to Mia as the face of a man who has stopped pretending he doesn't feel things. He looked exactly like that. At the altar's side, Rocco stood in the role he'd occupied his entire adult life, the one who kept the man standing. He handed Dante a folded handkerchief preemptively. Dante ignored it. Rocco kept it available. Between them, in the front row, Gia sat with the focused energy of a child who had been told her behavior today was very important and had taken the brief entirely too seriously. She wore a white dress. She carried a small basket of rose petals she had distributed approximately 30 seconds into the processional and then abandoned in favor of studying a beetle she found on the garden path. She had the beetle in her hand when Elena arrived at the altar. "Mama," she whispered urgently, "he has 6 legs. That's a lot of legs. Put him down, sweetheart. He doesn't want to be put down." Dante crouched briefly, examined the beetle with appropriate gravity, and said something in Gia's ear that made her nod seriously and set the beetle gently in the garden hedge. Then he stood and took Elena's hands. She looked up at him. "Ready?" she whispered. "I've been ready," he said, "since the night you walked back into my driveway." The ceremony was private. The words they exchanged personal enough that only the two of them and the officiant would remember the specifics. What the gathered family would remember afterward was the particular quality of the quiet when Dante said his vows. The steady, absolute tone of a man who means exactly what he says and has never once in his adult life promised something he did not intend to keep. What they would remember was Elena's face when she said hers. The amber eyes clear and unflinching, the voice steady, the ring she slid onto his finger held in hands that had learned to stop shaking. What they would remember was Gia standing up at the precise moment the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," throwing both arms wide and announcing to the garden, "Now they kiss!" They kissed, longer than was strictly ceremonial, briefer than they wanted. The garden applauded. The reception moved with the warmth of summer evenings and old wine and the particular joy of people who have come through something difficult and arrived somewhere whole. Mia danced with Rocco, who danced with the suppressed competence of a man who had never publicly admitted he could dance. Enzo gave a toast so composed and so moving that 3 capos quietly wiped their eyes and pretended they hadn't. Dante held Gia through the first dance, because she had asked, and because there was no version of this day in which he refused her anything reasonable. She stood on his shoes and he moved them both slowly around the cleared space, her dark curls level with his chest, her arms wrapped around his waist. "Are you happy?" she asked his shirt. He looked across the garden to where Elena stood with Mia, laughing at something, her veil loose and her shoes already off, barefoot in the grass of their garden. "Yes," he said, meaning it completely for the first time he could remember. "I'm happy." "Good," Gia decided. She patted his chest with the evaluative authority of a child conducting a wellness check. "Because I was worried." He looked down at her. "About what?" "Joshua at school says his papa is always grumpy." She looked up at him with those storm-gray eyes, his eyes in the perfect face of his daughter. "I told him you weren't grumpy. You were intense." He laughed, a real laugh, from deep, the kind that arrived without permission and ended without apology. When the song ended, Elena crossed the garden and took Gia, who accepted the transfer with sleepy compliance, already fading into the particular bonelessness of overtired children at evening events. Dante watched Elena settle their daughter against her shoulder, whispering something to Gia. The private language of mother and child, old and constant as tide. Then Elena turned to him, in the early evening light, with the garden lit from below and his family moving around them and his grandmother's ring on her finger. She looked at him the way she had looked at him the night he kissed her in the study, without defense, without the armor she'd spent years perfecting. She looked like his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He crossed to her, took her free hand, pressed his mouth to the back of it, the ring, the knuckles, the pulse at her wrist. "Unthinking," he said against her skin, "that 4 years ago, Something walked out of my building and left a hole in the empire that no amount of territory could fill. He raised his head. His eyes moved to Gia, asleep against her mother's shoulder, and then came back and brought more. Elena's mouth curved. Are you calling our daughter more? She's everything, he said simply. You're everything. He held her face in his hand. This is everything. She leaned into him. He wrapped his arm around her, their daughter between them, warm and heavy with sleep, breathing the slow breath of a child who has never once doubted she is loved. I used to run from this, she said quietly. I know. I'm done running. I know that too. He pressed his lips to her temple. You're not going anywhere, Principessa. She didn't argue. For the first time, she didn't argue. Above them, the Chicago skyline caught the last of the June light and threw it back in gold and amber and the particular blue-gray of a lake that has watched the city rise and break and rise again. Below them, the estate breathed with the warmth of a summer night and the low music of celebration. And in Dante's arms, against his chest, his daughter slept, and his wife, turned her face up to his and smiled. Daddy, Gia murmured in her sleep. He froze. Then he smiled slowly, the same smile as that first night in the driveway, deliberate, inevitable, the smile of a man who has understood something that changes everything. Except this time, the word wasn't an accident. This time it was the most certain thing in the world.